Okay, we're going to start week 8 of Old Testament backgrounds. So let's just start with a word of prayer. To God, I just thank you, Lord, for tonight, and I thank you for all of the weeks that we're able to spend just diving into your word and just to understand it better and just dig into the deeper things of you and appreciate everything that you've done in history for all the way leading up to your sacrifice. I just thank you, Lord, tonight that for those that are here, that you would give them ears to hear and you would give me the words to speak. In Jesus' name, amen. So, week 8, Evan, if you could put that slide up, we're going to talk about the history, continue on with the history books, and then go into Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Daniel, and Ezekiel. There we go. Yes. So we will pretty much stop right before the coming back out of exile. So we'll go all the way until they're, ready to come back from exile of 70 years. And I will finish that next year with my New Testament backgrounds that I will put that ending piece in the beginning to go into that. So from last week, we had discussed about the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. They had splits. They each had their own king line and their own capital. And then God allowed Assyria to come in and wipe out the northern kingdom. So I wanted to show you something first. We had the northern kingdom. Their capital was Samaria, and then the southern kingdom, and their capital was Jerusalem. Okay. So I'll show you what that means in a minute. First, I want to do Nahum, because that's where we had stopped. So Nahum gives his letter. He was a minor prophet, and he gave his letter during the time of Manasseh and Josiah's reign. He obviously spoke to the southern kingdom because there was no more northern kingdom. Assyria had wiped it out. And he had given judgment on Nineveh. So remember, Jonah came and said, repent. God said you're going to be destroyed if they repented, that the God's wrath would be subsided, and it did. They did repent, and God did not bring judgment. But then 100 years have gone by, and the actions from that generation were not passed down. And the people went back to their wickedness, went back to their evil. And so Nahum writes and says, okay, judgment's coming. The time of repentance is over, and you will be wiped out, and all of the wrath that has led up to this moment is going to be poured out on you, evil people of Nineveh. And it did. And the Ninevites were wiped out and were no more. So then Zephaniah comes along with his book, and he writes this during the king Josiah's reign. He talks to the southern kingdom, and he says that there's a time that is coming when God is going to make all things right, and that evil will be punished for all time. So he was calling the people to repentance in the southern kingdom and said, judgment is still coming for you. Even though the northern kingdom got their judgment and you think that you snuck by, that unless you repent and turn your hearts back, it's coming for you as well. And the people weren't very willing to accept that. And so he said that there's going to be, the Babylonians will come and bring judgment on Judah, which they did. And that it's okay that God allowed that to happen. He's also going to judge Babylon. So sometimes we think, when God uses wicked people for punishment on God's people, and that's not fair, they got away with it. No, they don't get away with it. Every person, every country, every leader will have to give an account and will reap what they sow. And so that's what he was talking about. And then he ends his book with a high note about this huge, wonderful blessing that both Jews and Gentiles will experience in the millennial kingdom. So here we go. We have more of the end times that he has in there. He talks about the tribulation period. He talks about the millennial reign of the Messiah. So I'm going to go back to the history books now. So only Judah was left with the southern kingdom of Judah. And Assyria, they loved to take people and deport them all around in different areas, because that way they don't revolt. If you're not surrounded by your common familiar land and your family and your friends, you tend to say, wait, well, let's just gather together and rebel. But if you are put in another country and your family's over here and you're over here, and it's much harder to do that. So it was a brilliant idea that it worked, where people didn't revolt as easily against Assyria. But what had happened is so they took over this northern kingdom, and they took the capital of Samaria, and they just deposited many Babylonians and all these people from all different countries, as well as some Jews, and so things got mixed up. And the descendants of these foreigners and Israel coming together were called the Samaritans. And so that's where you have this unclean mixed ancestry between the two. And so the Jews were like, well, you're not really pure because you didn't come from the Jewish line. You added in some Babylonian, some other things. And there was a distinction between their views. So there was a reason why the Jews just didn't look at them and just judge them based on, who their father and their mother was. It was also a belief system. So I wanted to show you the difference between those two. So when Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman at the well, and she said, well, the Samaritans say, the Jews say, what do you say, Jesus? And you're like, why is she bringing up all these things? Because this was a very important part that they fought over all the time. So the Samaritans, we're going to put Samaritans over here. And then the Jews. Okay, so the Samaritans, they only believed in the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They're the only one, they just said, that's it, that's God's word. The end. What did the Jews think? They believed in all scripture in the Old Testament. That included the history books, the prophets, all of those things. So that was one big, that's a big, saying, oh, the Torah is the only inspired word of God. And then the Jews were saying, no, it's all of it, the whole Bible of the Old Testament that they had. The second thing that they thought was that the true sanctuary of God, the place of worship, was on Mount, let me make sure I spell this right, Gerizim. Okay, and over here, true worship, Jerusalem, temple. So, this is where the Samaritan woman said to Jesus, well, we say that we can worship God on the mountain, and you Jews say that you have to go to Jerusalem at the temple. Where's the right place to worship? And Jesus was saying, no, all of those that, are going to be worshiping me soon in spirit and in truth. And he brought up that point because she was trying to get him upset. She was bringing up points like, well, we believe this and you believe this. So which one's true, Messiah? And so this is what she was referring to. So the third thing is that they believe that the Levites were the highest authority in terms of interpreting the word. And over here, they would say rabbis. Were the highest authority with interpreting the word. So Paul, he was being trained up as a rabbi by his education, and that's why he was so knowledgeable with the word and knew it really well, because he was becoming that highest rank and being able to interpret it and teach it. But the Samaritans said, no, it was just the Levite tribe. It had nothing to do with whether or not you were trained as a rabbi, and rabbis didn't have to be from the Levites on the Jews' end, but Samaritans said it was just the tribe of Levi because of what it was in the Old Testament in the Torah. And then the final thing is that the Samaritans rejected all prophets. So, the prophet books, the major and minor prophets, Samaritans said that's not from God. They did believe in parts of Joshua, parts of the book of Joshua, and they said that the last prophet was Moses. He was the end. There was no more prophets after Moses. Jews said, no, there's the prophet book saying God still speaks through prophets today. That's why that when Jesus came and they asked, is he a prophet? Or, some people claimed to be he was a prophet. Samaritans would say, well, there is no more prophets. Moses was the last one. God doesn't work that way. He only speaks through his word in the Torah. He doesn't speak outside of the Torah. Okay. So there was these major things that caused them a lot of controversy. There was a lot of hatred. The Jews hated the Samaritans. They felt like they were impure. They felt like their beliefs were warped. And so they thought, you are the lowest of all lows. They would actually accept a Gentile more than a Samaritan. That's how much hatred there was between them. So when Jesus brought up, I know this is Old Testament backgrounds, but when Jesus brought up the parable, when he said about the Good Samaritan, he was talking to the Jews, and he gave that parable because he was trying to say, of all the people, the lowest of lows, I'm going to bring up and say that that person was better in his actions than you just being a Jew. The Levite walked by, but the Samaritan took time to care for the one that was hurting. And so he picks an example to show that what they were doing was wrong, with putting a barrier between the two people. So that's a little bit about that. So that's where it stemmed from, was when Assyria came and just put their own people into Samaria, and then they got intermingled with the Jews, and then here comes a new line of people called the Samaritans. So back to the story. So whenever this was happening with, you have Assyria coming in, at the bottom in the south, Babylon begins to try to form a new country. They try to find each other. So they're all scattered everywhere. And they came together, and the Assyrians let them do it because they were fascinated by Babylon. They thought their beliefs were interesting. I mean, Babylon went back to Hammurabi. Remember the Code of Hammurabi with Moses, before Moses' time? So that was Babylon. They were there a long, 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 long time. And Assyria wasn't there as long. And so they were very interested in Babylonian history and how they thought and all of these things. And so they let them form this small country and have their own little people kingdoms, and thought, well, they're not a threat. They're too small, so we're just going to let them do that. And so Babylon did. And King Hezekiah of the southern kingdom said he invited the Babylonian ambassadors, you can read about it in Chronicles, he invited them to come look at his temple, and he showed them his temple and all the glorious riches of the temple. So why was he doing this? So remember, King Hezekiah, he loved the Lord, but his major fault was that he wanted to form alliances. God kept saying, don't do it, Hezekiah, don't do it. And he kept trying to form these alliances with other countries because he felt like that was security. So instead of putting his security in God, knowing that God has been his protector, he puts it into the alliances with other countries, and he depends on them. And so he brought them in to say, look what I have, so let's talk. Let's form an alliance against Assyria, and let's rise up against them. And God was not happy. So Assyria gets word of this. And so Sennacherib, he's the guy that came in and sent his captain of the guard that mocked Israel and mocked Yahweh, and then the angel came and wiped out 120,000 of the Assyrians. So Sennacherib is that. He's still king, he's still alive, and he hears that King Hezekiah did this, even though King Hezekiah surrendered, on paper, he sent him a tribute, he did all that. So Sennacherib gets upset, and he comes in, and there's this, next to Jerusalem, there's this city called Lachish, and it was an income-making city for Hezekiah. So everyone that traveled through had to pay a fee to Hezekiah. He was making, some nice change on the side, and so Sennacherib comes and just wipes it out. And then goes back home and puts it on his wall of his palace, a picture of the siege of Lachish as a trophy of, look what I did, Hezekiah. You don't mess with me. So then Sennacherib ends up dying, just like Isaiah said. Isaiah said that there will be a rumor that will cause Sennacherib to go home and he will be assassinated in his own land. So he's assassinated by his 2 sons, go figure, who want to become king. And so his line, he stopped with that. So his son becomes the next king, and he focuses on building the country bigger. He defeats the northern part of Egypt and adds that to Assyria. And then he dies, and his son, the next king, I'm not going to give you the names because I'm not going to bore you, and they're really confusing and long. He's the last king, and this guy is Assurbanipal. He's the last king of Assyria. He defeats all of Egypt, most of Egypt. But, he likes to study. So he builds all these libraries, and he does all of these tablets and books, and he really promotes studying and knowledge. Well, so you have Babylon at the bottom of southern part of below Assyria. And they decide, we've had enough. We're tired of Assyria. They don't share the fascination that Assyria has with them. They don't share that. They hate Assyria. And so in the bottom, in Babylon, Nabopolassar, he's the king at the time. And he decides that he's going to rise up against Assyria. So he fights Assyria. And so when, if you have Syria, I wish I had like a bigger screen with a map to really show you, but so Babylon is down here. And there's a reason I'm doing this. Egypt's on this side. Okay, so you have Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. And then you have little Israel right here. Okay, so Assyria and Babylon are going to war. And Egypt hears about this. And even though, so Egypt is conquered technically by Assyria, but they let them have a pharaoh, and the pharaoh's name was Necho. So King Necho, Pharaoh Necho, he's in Egypt, and he hears about this war, and he sends aid to Assyria to help them defeat Babylon. And as they're going up to Assyria to give aid, Israel, well, it was Judah, technically, King Josiah is in charge right now, and he was a great king. He was the one that when he was 8 years old, he became king, and he said, I'm not going to just purge the land of all of the worshiping to Baal. I'm going to go after the Asherah poles. I'm going to go after all of the things that show any resemblance to any god but Yahweh. And then they took the people that were priests for Baal and for all these things, and they killed them and burned their bones. I mean, it was a big deal. He was like wiping out all of the impurities and all of the things. He brought out the book of the law because it was put away and it wasn't being followed. And he said, we're going to honor God. So he was a great king, but unfortunately, his people, it didn't flow down very well. They were still being rebellious. In the beginning, they were willing to, oh, yes, and they got excited about it. But then they began to turn their hearts away from the Lord. And so Josiah, he's king at the time, and he decides to stop the Egyptians from helping Assyria. And so he comes at them to confront them on their way up. And unfortunately, Josiah dies during that fight, that battle. And so since he died with King Necho that was on his way up, King Necho says, okay, well, I guess I'm in charge of this providence at the moment. So he puts his own man in. That was, let me get his name because it is strange. Jehoiakim, if you ever remember reading his name in the Bible. Let me see, Akim. Okay. He's the next king of Judah, but he was placed there by the Egyptians. Okay. So he's the king placed there by King Necho. And so he decides, so they continue to go up, and they have this big battle still with Babylon. And Babylon wins. They win the battle. And so at this point, they decide to take any person that was an Assyrian in their area of the southern part, and they just started killing them or deporting them, like get out of our country. We don't want a single Assyrian in our country. And they targeted them and got rid of all the Assyrians out of Babylon. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and go to a couple of the minor prophets that wrote during this time. It was Habakkuk and Jeremiah. So, Habakkuk is a conversation letter. It's really interesting because it's not just a history telling or thus saith the Lord. It is like a journal that he is asking God questions like, why is this happening? And God would answer him, and then he would ask a second question like, well, okay, but why, what about this part of it? And God would answer him, and he would be like, that's good, God. And he'd give a conclusion. So it's like these conversations that he would have. And the main theme of his book is it's like, why do good things happen to bad people? And why do bad things happen to good people? You know, that we all have those questions. Like, why is all this bad stuff happening? These are good people. Why would God allow? And what about all these bad people? And they're not getting judged, immediately for their sin. They seem to get away with it. And so that was Habakkuk's question was, there's still some good people in Judah that are getting killed and wiped out. Why would you allow that, God? And why would you allow the Assyrians to come in and destroy your country of Israel, and they're evil? Why aren't they being punished? And so it's this back and forth thing that God has with him, with Habakkuk, and he realizes that even though evil is allowed for a season, that God comes in and he brings hope and deliverance. So remember, like when they went into captivity, it wasn't like God said, okay, that's it, I'm done with you. I'm wiping my hands, you're done. You're no longer a country of Israel. God said, take hope. I am with you. And when you turn your hearts back to me, I will deliver you. I will come in. And he gave him these promises by saying that he has a purpose to everything he does. So even though we might not understand in the moment why are these things happening or what's going on in the background, God knows, and that God has a plan, and he's not surprised by anything, and he will do everything as he has prophesied and foretold. There's no such thing as delayed prophetic fulfillment. God may say, I am putting it aside for a season, and it will come to pass at this point. But God's not like, oh man, I wish I would have done it then. I should have done it then because it got delayed. Never. God always knows. He always has the perfect timing for everything to being fulfilled. And Habakkuk ends his letter in the fact with the future millennial kingdom by saying that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And that's how he ends his book. So Jeremiah, if we go on to him, so Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet because he cried a lot. It was a lot of, he also wrote the book of Lamentations, and so it was like, oh Israel, why are you walking in these ways? Turn back to God. Oh, please turn back to God. Why are you doing this? And then he goes on, and God's going to bring judgment if you don't turn back, and it's just like crying and crying and crying. So he's the weeping prophet that prophesied to the southern kingdom that judgment is coming. He had a 42-year ministry to the southern kingdom, and he did give hope. He's like, even though these things are going to happen to you, and God showed me they're going to happen, and it's horrible, God's still bringing hope. He's still going to give you back a future and a hope. So remember Jeremiah 29:11? If my people who are called by my name, that was at the moment that they were being taken away into captivity. And God said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from the wicked ways, I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. Their land that is being torn away from them at the moment, I will bring you back. There is hope. And so that's what the promise that he gave to them at that time. He says in his book as well that people will no longer say, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt, because that's what they would say all the way up to this point. Like, that was the biggest thing. The Lord brought us out of Egypt, so listen to what he has to say. He wants to take care of us. But he said there's going to come a day when it's going to say, the Lord brought the Israelites out of the lands that they were banished from, and they will live again in their own land. And that didn't happen until the 1948. From the point of captivity all the way till that moment, almost 2,000 years later, there was or more than that. I mean, it was 2,500-ish years, 400. It was nothing. There was nothing there. There wasn't a country of Israel. God didn't bring them back. They were banished all over the world. And so Jeremiah's word of God's going to bring you back, you're going to have a land again, was fulfilled now in this generation than it was back then. That was more of a modern fulfillment. So, 1,878 years of being scattered all over the world, and then they brought him back. In Jeremiah, he talks about the types of judgments that God has. So God has a judgment where, it's called abandonment wrath. So he holds his hands up and says, you chose to walk disobedient and you don't want me in your culture? Okay, you will deal with your own consequences, because what you reap, you will sow. And then there's the type of wrath, and that's in Romans 1, that you have to deal with your own consequences for your actions. And then there's God's wrath that's active and intentional. So that's like Revelation, the prophetic books, the cup of wrath that is fulfilled. And that's like the day of the Lord, in the end times, it talks about the tribulation period. So it's this point of your country has built up enough wrath that now it's coming. Judgment's coming. The time of repentance is over, it's coming. And that is the intentional wrath. And then the third type of wrath is about the great white throne of judgment in heaven, that all mankind at the end of days, everything is wiped out. There's no longer a heaven and earth. We're all in heaven at this great white throne, and we will have to give an account for everything that we did. And that's a spiritual judgment. So Jeremiah really discusses the end times, just like Isaiah, just like, Revelation and Daniel. But he also goes into it, and he talks about in Jeremiah 25 about, the 70-year captivity. He brings out the point, it's 70 years. But your God's gonna bring you back. And he talks about the future end time tribulation period. In verse 38, he says that Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and that the Lion will begin to judge the earth during the 7-year tribulation, and then come back to come as the Lion of Judah to bring against Satan, and in this big battle with Armageddon, which they don't call it that in Jeremiah. So to go through the account of his book, in the beginning it talks about regathering the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. Then there will be a tribulation. Then there will be a great tribulation and Jacob's trouble, which is the second half of tribulation period. Then there's going to be this millennial kingdom. And then he goes over by going back and saying, okay, there's going to be a disbursement of the Jewish people that God's going to regather and bring back, but that there will be a remnant that will turn their hearts to the Lord and accept the Messiah. There will be this Gog and Magog war. There will be a tribulation and the great tribulation. In Jeremiah 31, he says that there will be a remnant that will finally see that the Messiah was God and will accept him. So we know that's Jesus. And in Romans 9, it also talks about that as well. And then he talks about the Davidic covenant. So if you think of the people that were being taken away from their land, they think, wait a minute, what happened to the Abrahamic covenant? What happened to the Davidic covenant? All of those things that God promised Abraham and David is saying, that you will have as many descendants, and you will have a king on the throne forever. Well, there's no more kings, God. Did you abandon us? All those things that Satan likes to play, like God's rejected you, God's not going to fulfill what he said. And so Jeremiah is saying, oh no, that's going to come. That line that God's preserving is still there, even though there might not be a king technically on the throne, that there is a king that is coming that will be fulfilling that with David's, the promise given to David, which we know is Jesus. So Jerusalem is called the city of God in Jeremiah. And then he talks about Babylon as rebellious and evil. And they have two forms of Babylon show up in the Old Testament. One is that Babylon is talked about as man-centered. It's God-defying religious form with like the Tower of Babel. They talk about that being like in the spirit of Babylon. And then Babylon being this conquering, wealthy, political form with King Nebuchadnezzar, when he has his whole kingdom set up, which I'll go into. And so there's this whole section in Jeremiah about Babylon and what God's going to do with judging Babylon and having them fall. So back to the history books. We are on Carchemish. So when I said that King Necho went up to Assyria, he did get defeated, or because Babylon, came and they won. He went back. Well, he decides to do a second round, and he's going to go against Babylon himself. So that was a very unwise move. And it's in Jeremiah chapter 46, and it talks about this war at Carchemish. So Egypt comes against Babylon, and Egypt gets totally destroyed. Babylon wins, wipes them out. And the general that is leading the army of Babylon is Nebuchadnezzar. He is the general. And he comes and he, is done with this war. It's a huge victory, Carchemish. And as he's finishing up the war, he hears that his father, Nabopolassar, has died. And so he knows everyone wants that throne. It's like if the whole assassinations happen all the time, the sons assassinate the father to get the throne. Everyone wants to be king. So he knows if he doesn't get there quickly to be crowned the next king, someone else is going to take his place, and then he'll have to fight him. So he leaves by himself, and he goes across the desert, and they say there's like this one, so the path that he should have taken, if I had a map, it would be easier to show you, but he's like right here between Egypt and Babylon, and the path is like to go up here, over the mountains, you come down, and you come back down here, and he just went straight, because he wanted the shortest path. Well, that shortest path was very deadly. It was very dangerous. There wasn't a lot of shelter. He could have easily gotten killed, but he was very determined. It shows the type of personality he had. So he came back. He made it. He was crowned the next king. So here's King Nebuchadnezzar. He is now the next king of Babylon. And while that is happening, Judah decides to revolt against Babylon during King Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin's reign. So Jehoiachin is after Jehoiakim. And so they decide to revolt against Babylon, which was a really stupid move because they were so small. I mean, if Babylon could defeat Assyria and Josiah tried to stop the Egyptians and lost, why in the world they thought that they could defeat Babylon, I don't know. But they tried and they lost, of course. And so Babylon's just thinking they're just like a flea on their side. They're just like, go home. Just go. We defeated you. Just leave us alone. Just go home. So they weren't going to mess with Judah. Well, in 587 BC, Judah decides to revolt a second time under Zedekiah. So this is an important name. Zedekiah is now king. Zedekiah is smart. And he knows, we're not going to defeat Babylon. What are you doing? But his religious leaders say, no, remember what happened? How the Lord helped Jerusalem and defended us with the angel of the Lord that came in and wiped out all those Assyrians in the middle of the night. And King Hezekiah didn't have to do anything, and God just came into the victory. That's what God's going to do this time. We know it. We know he's going to do it. And so Zedekiah brings in Jeremiah, and he says, Jeremiah, what does the Lord say? And Jeremiah said, you're going to be destroyed unless you submit yourself to Babylon. But the religious leaders were like, no, God did it before. He did it. Remember, it's there. He did it. He's going to do it again. We're going to force his hand. If we just say, let's revolt, God's not going to let Jerusalem fall. That's his holy city. So do you see how, seems like that happens a lot throughout history where they kind of think that they have one up on God, and it's like we're going to force his hand to come through because he would never do such a thing because he did it before, so he's going to do it the same exact way. Well, God doesn't like that. He does not do the same thing the same way all the time. And so they decide to revolt, and so they do it. Well, Zedekiah, he believes Jeremiah. He knows he's going to lose. So he takes his family into the desert, and they flee to Egypt during this battle. Well, of course, Judah is totally gets wiped out. And this is the time where that's the end. There is no more Judah. Because King Nebuchadnezzar, now he's king, and he let them the first time, the first revolt, he let them go home. But this time he's like, you're going to do this again? I'm going to just wipe you out. And he comes in, he destroys Jerusalem, he strips the temple, he takes everything back home, and Judah is no more a country. But here's Zedekiah and his family, and they're running through the desert. And so Nebuchadnezzar's like, oh no, I'm going to make an example out of you. You revolted a second time. So he went after Zedekiah. He took him and his family, and then he killed one member at a time in front of Zedekiah, of his whole family. And then he gouged out his eyes, so that was the last thing he saw. And he brings Zedekiah back as a living trophy into the king of Babylon, his palace. So Nebuchadnezzar wasn't this nice guy that with Daniel and all those things, and you think when Daniel said, can we just have vegetables, and not eat the king's meat, it wasn't like this guy was a lenient man. He wasn't like, sure, whatever you want, Daniel, because I like you. He was very bloodthirsty. You don't defy the king. So there are certain moments that, when Daniel made those attempts, it was more than just a simple request. It was like, my life's on the line, but I'm not going to defy my God, and I know my God is going to protect me, and even if he doesn't, I'm still not going to defile myself before the Lord. And he took that stand of faith against Nebuchadnezzar. But King Nebuchadnezzar, sometimes he gets painted this picture that he's just like, sure, whatever, and he's not. And that's why he did that statue we'll get into later, and he, commands everyone to the fiery furnace. That's Nebuchadnezzar, a very, very evil man. So Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he strips away all of Israel. So there's no more Judah, there's no more Israel, there's no more land. And he destroys the temple, the Solomon temple. He takes everything back. He takes the ark back, he takes it all. And so the 70 years of captivity start. And, whenever the people were allowed to return home, there was only 50,000 that did. It wasn't like everyone, all the Jews, the millions of them. It's not like they all said, yes, we can go back, let's go back. They became content living in. 70 years is a long time. That's a different whole generation that upgrew in a different land. And they thought, why do we need to go back to Israel? I mean, I'm happy here. God's with me here. But 50,000 went back and survived as a people group nation without a nation. And they're the only ones in history that were able to make it from the ancients all the way to the modern day. And it stayed as a country without a country, even through the Roman times. A lot of the people groups there, they just fell and fell apart. But Israel remained Israel. And you can see how God's hand was on them. It wasn't just that they had an excitement for their land and for their country. It was the Lord's grace that allowed them to be a people group during all of this. So they kept a national identity during the exile years. So I'm going to pause and go to Lamentations, because this is where Lamentations comes in, written by Jeremiah. And this is his laments of grief that it actually has happened. He knew that God was going to destroy Judah. He knew Nebuchadnezzar was going to come and the Babylonians would come in and destroy them. But it still hurts going through it, and it still causes pain seeing all of the destruction that happened. So he writes these laments. They're 5 poems, and there's one for each chapter. Each chapter has its own poem, and each verse of every chapter uses a Hebrew letter. So there's 22 Hebrew letters of the alphabet, and every verse uses a different one the whole way down. Except for the middle chapter, chapter 3, that has 66 verses that's in it. And throughout the whole time, he is talking about that even though this destruction has come, that God still has his hand on his people. And what's really sad about Jeremiah is he was rejected, he wasn't believed, he was hated, he was laughed at, and he never saw the fruit. He never saw the people turn their hearts back. And it wasn't until much later time when God, brought his people and did all of these things, and that, his prophetic words came to pass. But he didn't get to see it in his own lifetime. And so what it shows is that regardless of in our own personal lives, whether or not we see God move, that we are obedient and kept, being responsible with the Lord, regardless of how others respond. If the Lord's told you to do something or go in this certain direction, and you keep getting opposition and no one's listening, it doesn't mean it's not God. You have to keep going through it because the Lord's hand is on it, and in due season, you will reap a harvest. So, going back after Lamentations to the rest of this history, I have, Evan, can you put the next slide? Okay, I actually should have done that earlier. So if you can see Babylon takes over Egypt, and is smaller than the Assyrian Empire, but extremely powerful. And you can see the Syria in the middle, Nineveh, all of that's covered at the Babylonian Empire. And you see that you have above it is the Medes, the Median Empire, the Medes, and that they're going to come into play. And Persia's at the bottom of that after the Babylonians. So King Nebuchadnezzar, his later years are obscure. It doesn't really give too many details about King Nebuchadnezzar during his reign. There's not a lot of details given during the captivity of Israel and Judah, but we know some bits. And so it does talk about him defiling God, and that God struck him with a disease. And this disease caused him to eat grass like an animal. And he lived out there for many years, and the people were like, this is odd, this is weird that our king, he's crazy, and so he's eating grass and doing all these weird things. But he humbles himself, and God brings his right mind back, and he comes and the Lord delivers him from that. And then, we know a lot about Nebuchadnezzar during the book of Daniel, which I'll go into in a minute. But I wanted to continue a little bit on before I get to Daniel, because Daniel is so wide encompassed with a bunch of different years that I wanted to kind of cover before I get to him. So his son, Nabonidus, becomes the next king after King Nebuchadnezzar dies. And Nabonidus, this may be, due to his father going crazy a little bit, that Nabonidus kind of gets obsessed. So there's this god named Sin. It's spelled Sin, S-I-N. It's the moon god of the Babylonians. And it was there from way back with Hammurabi. I mean, it's been there a long, long time that they worship this god. And so Nabonidus decided to offer a temple to this god. And he went into the desert, created an oasis, spent all this money on making an oasis in the middle of the desert to the moon god Sin so that they could worship him, and abandoned the country. And so they were like, and Babylonians thought, well, what are we going to do? So his son, Belshazzar, is the reigning king, because his dad left and decided to offer this moon god a temple in the middle of the desert. And that's the last that you really hear about him. You don't really know what went on after that. It wasn't successful. I don't know if he ended up dying there. But, with Sin, Mount Sinai is actually named after him. So it's been around a long, long, long time. Belshazzar is now the king of Babylon. And this is where, in Daniel, he orders this banquet, and he says, bring out all the gold vessels from that temple in Israel and Judah. And so they bring out all the special things that were meant for the Lord. And he's partying with them and drinking and having a good old time. And suddenly, in the middle of his party, there's a hand that appears. And the hand writes something on the wall, and he freaks out. And so Daniel, he's there, and as a wise man. And so, he was there with Nebuchadnezzar, he was there with the son, he was there with Belshazzar, and he's there much later on, all the way down to Darius when you have the lion's den. And so they think, well, let's bring him out. He's a wise man, so bring out Daniel. Maybe he can understand what this is. So it's not that he didn't know what the words, the interpretation, or the translation. He understood the translation of the words. He knew what they meant, but he didn't understand the interpretation. It's like if you saw a hand writing on the wall and it was writing couple, like go, CC, and you're like, well, I know what that says, go, CC, but what does it mean? Do you see? So that's what it was. So this is what was written on the wall. Let me make it big enough. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Okay. So, what does this mean? Mene means numbered. Tekel means weighed. And Upharsin means separated. So what he saw was numbered, weighed, separated. What in the world does that mean? And it was done by someone's hand, not even a person that was appeared. It was just the hand that wrote on the wall, and it freaked him out. And so Daniel came in and he said, "This is the interpretation, king." He said that God is saying that your days are numbered. Your behavior is weighed and found lacking, and that you're going to be separated from your kingdom. But there's more to this than just this, because God played a word play with the Babylonians. So Babylon, they loved the word plays and like homonyms, and this means this, but let's make it mean this. And they like to play these riddles, okay? They loved it. So God meets them where they are and gives them a riddle. And so what's really cool is that, so the homonym part is with the haparsin. So haparsin is actually where we get the word Pharisee from, which means separated. They wanted to be separate, so they called themselves Pharisees. But it's homonym for the word Persian. So in case you didn't know what a homonym was, homonym is the same. It's the word that sounds the same as another word but has a different meaning, like he went to the store, or the number two. That's a homonym. So haparsin meant separated, but the word haparsin was spelled differently but meant Persian. So the wordplay, the pun that God was giving, was that it wasn't just that you were going to be separated, you were also going to be separated out by the Persians, and they will be the ones to come in and destroy you. So that's what happened that night. So for up to this point, they were already at war with the Persians. There was this war going on, this siege back and forth, but Babylon was still in control. So it wasn't like a total shock that the Persians were suddenly there. Like, where'd they come from that night? They just decided to show up. No, they were at war for a year, but Babylon totally won every time. They were stronger than the Persians. But that night, that after God did that with Belshazzar, Cyrus, so remember Cyrus that Isaiah spoke about, that said man's going to name Cyrus, he's going to come, he's going to bring the people back. They're going to rebuild the temple. He's going to help. He's going to say it. He's going to say, rebuild your temple, rebuild Jerusalem. Cyrus was coming. And that was 150 years before Cyrus was born. Well, here's Cyrus. Cyrus was a general. General Cyrus of the Persians. Okay? And he comes and he kills Belshazzar. And he takes over Babylon. It's done. It is now Persia. And so there was, if you look up there, the Medes and the Persians were two different tribes. And there's 5 tribes, but there's the 2 that came together and decided to form an alliance to go against Babylon. And they did, and they won. So that's why it's called the Medo-Persian Empire that comes next, is because it's 2 different tribes, the Medes and the Persians, that came together. But they're under Cyrus the Great. So he unites them. The first one to unite both tribes under a leadership is Cyrus. Evan, if you could do the next slide. Okay, so that's to give you a look at what Cyrus ended up conquering, and it became, the Persian Empire was so big. It was bigger than the Romans. It equaled, they said, pretty much like the British Empire. If you remember all the time when Britain owned like everything, like all the countries in Europe and over in America and all these different places, that's the land mass was equal to the Persian Empire. They owned so much land. The Romans came after later on, and they owned less land but more people. So they had more people to govern, but the Persians were huge. So Cyrus, what's really interesting about Cyrus is that he was the first humanitarian king. He said people's rights are the most important and they should be obeyed. Instead of it being, I'm the ultimate control and whatever I say you have to do, he wanted them to look at him as like, I'm helping you. I am freeing you from all these evil kings and giving you freedom. So he came into Babylon, who was being ruled by a dictator pretty much, and just said, go home, go back to your lands that you were taken from, May you live prosperous, and I'll help you do it. And so they actually, in the United Nations, they have a Cyrus cylinder that's named after Cyrus the Great as a symbol of human rights. You can see it. It's there as something that is meant for that. So he's really well known as this humanitarian king. And he did a couple things. So he encouraged local religions. So religious freedom. You want to believe in this God? Believe in it. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. You want to believe in Jehovah? Go ahead. That's fine. Whatever you want to believe in. So he didn't enforce gods or culture like the Babylonians and Assyrians did. Cyrus showed leniency to local people. So he won their loyalty. He was very lenient. He said, as long as you don't rebel against me, you can have self-governing rule. If you want to set up your own kings, go ahead. But just don't rebel against me. But you can have your own thing, your own laws, your own people group. So he's very lenient. And total opposite side of the pendulum with Assyria. Assyria came in, brutality, force, evil. You do what we say or we kill you. We do, evil acts. And then here comes Cyrus, and he's just like, everyone's peace. Let's just have peace and harmony. So the third thing he did is that he encouraged and supported opportunities of those who had been deported to return to their homeland. So this is where Jews, you can go back. You can go back to and rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild your temple. I will help you. I don't care. You can go back home. And the fourth is that he was the world's first leader to rule with effective, positive propaganda. So he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. I am here to liberate you, to bring you freedom from government control. You are now free under my rule, even though he was a conqueror. He came and conquered all those areas, and he continued to conquer, as you can see, by Cyrus, all of his life. But it was portrayed in a way that caused the people to love him, and they didn't rebel. So it worked. And he died a warrior's death. So he was at battle, fighting when he died, and they brought his body back. They made this huge monument for him that is still standing, that you can go and see parts of it. I mean, his body's gone and all those other things are gone, but you can see what was given to Cyrus as a monument of how great of a king he was. Okay, so I'm going to go into Daniel. So with Daniel, the beginning part of it is a history type book, and then it goes into the whole prophetic of the end times and everything that God showed Daniel, which I'm just going to highlight generally, but I'm not going to go into because I want a separate class for that. So in Daniel, he's one of the captives that are taken from to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. So he was in Judah. He was there when Zedekiah was king, and then they rebelled, and then they got wiped out by Nebuchadnezzar, and all these people came back. And that is Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, that's not their real names. They were given new names. Daniel's name was actually given as starts with a B. I should know this. It's similar to Belshazzar, but it's very close to that. And then the other names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is Babylonian names. And the reason that they did that is because you give a new name to a new identity. If you want the people that you're taking captives from to accept you as their new identity, you have to change their living area. So they're now in Babylon. You change their names so they don't have the same identity pull to their country. And then you change the way that they eat and their culture that they're doing. So you force them to eat the king's meat. You force them to learn the king's laws and their culture and the way of life and the gods and honoring those things so that they become Babylonian. And so that's what Daniel was put into. He was put into that position as a young man, that he was forced out of his country. He was forced to have a different name. He was forced to have, a different way of life. But he refused to be compromised. He refused to let the king take away, okay, give me a new name, that's fine, but I'm not going to reject my God. I'm not going to do what God says not to do. And he held on to that, and so did his buddies, which that's why whenever Nebuchadnezzar set up this big, giant statue of himself, because he thought he was the best thing on earth for conquering so many people, and he said, now bow down or you're going to be killed in the fiery furnace, his friends did not. And where was Daniel during that time? So Daniel was so well liked by King Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel was put as a governor in a whole separate town. So it was a huge country, and here's Daniel way over here, and in the king's palace was still his friends. So whenever King Nebuchadnezzar has a statue and calls everyone to bow down to it, Daniel wasn't even around. It wasn't that Daniel bowed down and got away with it and, wasn't thrown in the fiery furnace. It was that he wasn't even there, but his 3 friends were, and God shows up. So we believe that, when it says in the Bible, a lot of times it'll say the angel of the Lord did this, the angel of the Lord. There's a really good, strong correlation between the angel of the Lord and Jesus. And so when you hear the things that the angel of the Lord did in the Old Testament, it's most likely Jesus. And whenever that 4th man was shown in the fire that looked like a god, Jesus, most likely. It doesn't say that, but there's a really good indication that it was. Okay, Evan, if you can put the next slide. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And in this dream, there are 4 major nations that are being spoken of. So in his dream, all he sees is the statue. He doesn't know what it means. He doesn't understand it. He just sees this magnificent statue. It has gold, it has silver, it has bronze, it has iron, and then clay and iron mixed for the feet and toes. So, and then he sees this big rock come and smash it to pieces. Okay, so that's what his dream, and he gets really freaked out about that because dreams are very holy from the gods. That's how they believe that the gods communicated with them. So he knew it was very special because it wasn't something he just made up in his mind. And he wanted his wise men to interpret it, and no one could. And so here comes Daniel, and he's brought in, and he's able to tell the king not only what the dream was, but its interpretation. So the first one is Babylon. That is the king head up there, the statue head of gold. That is the kingdom of Babylon. And so Daniel says, so right now it's Babylon. That's what is current in that moment. And he says, King Nebuchadnezzar, this is your country, but it's going to be overcome by a kingdom of Persia will come, and that's King Cyrus. And that is the silver that will come and take over. And then later on, there's this kingdom that's coming with Greece. Alexander the Great leads that, and that is the bronze. And then comes this kingdom of Rome, and Rome is going to come. It's going to be the legs of iron. It's going to be divided into 2, and at the bottom, it will be a kingdom of the Roman Empire that's mixed. It's weaker. It's a lesser form, and that's the feet and the toes made of iron and clay. So let me go through that. So we have the Babylon. After Babylon, Persia comes in with King Cyrus, wipes out Babylon. Then comes Greece with Alexander the Great that wipes out Persia. Then comes Rome after that takes over Greece. Rome is split into 2 legs, and this is fulfilled in 395 AD when the Easter leg separated from Rome and established their own capital of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. And they broke up into nation states. So the kingdom of Rome was split in 2, and then you had one side that ended up just breaking up into different nation states that happened with that. And then the feet and the toes that were gonna be the Roman Empire, but not as strong as the original Roman Empire, that was going to be struck by a rock, and that would completely destroy the temple, and it would become a mountain and fulfill the whole earth. So this bottom part has yet to be fulfilled. So there is it's talked about in Revelation as well. There is going to be a new Roman Empire that comes and gets established, and that the Antichrist will help rule, and that he's going to have 10 kings ruling him, 10 people, 10 leaders that will be ruling with him, and that there will be a rock, which we know who is the rock? Jesus, who's going to come and destroy the Antichrist, destroy the whole thing, and fill up the entire earth because of the millennial reign. That he will be king. There is no more kingdoms after him. It's the end. It's done. That he will destroy everything else, and he will be the next leader. So there are a couple different figures in history that have tried to reestablish the Roman Empire. Napoleon came, and that was the early 1800s. He just tried to take over the world and do this similar thing with having this Roman-type state. He wanted to revive the Roman Empire. It failed, didn't work. Hitler, 1940s, that was his plan. He had a thing called 1,000-year Third Reich. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Reich. Okay, so that was his goal. He wanted to bring about the Roman Empire and be in control of all of it. Well, we know that didn't work. He was a Antichrist, but he wasn't the Antichrist. So they look at, right now we have the United Nations, and we have different people that are representing different nations in that. And so there are, this is all just speculation, but there's a lot of prophetic experts that see it as a foundation for these 10 kings. Where do you get the 10 kings from come? Well, if you have people from the United Nations talking together, they already have the United Nations, and here comes the Antichrist that is now control of it, and they submit to his leadership, but they each have their own little reign. Then that would fulfill the 10 horns in Revelation 17 that talk about these 10 rulers that the Antichrist will have. It all comes back to the Antichrist, and that Jesus will come and destroy him when that happens in the Battle of Armageddon. That's all I'm going to go into it for now. Evan, if you want to go to the next one. So this is, again, really brief overview of the end times. You have the rapture of the church, which, by the way, we don't know the day or the hour. We don't know if it's before the tribulation, in the middle, or at the end. We can speculate. We can say there's strong evidence supporting this, but the Bible does not explicitly say when it's going to happen. So we have the rapture. Let's say it's at the beginning. Then you have the years of the tribulation. So that's a 7-year reign of the Antichrist that's going to have a covenant contract with Israel, a peace that he will break in the middle. After 3.5 years, he will break that contract. He will stand on top of the temple, which will already be built at that moment, and he will declare himself as God, and that's the abomination of desolation. And then he dies, he comes back to life, he does the mark of the beast, this great tribulation for 3.5 years, he sets himself against God, and then Jesus comes in all of his glory as the second coming, not the rapture, the second coming that spoke about, and he comes to the earth with all of us that are with, in the Lord, that will be caught up, and we will come down, and that is where he has the battle of Armageddon against the Antichrist, and he wins. He has the fire coming out of his eyes. This is no longer a lamb, this is a lion, and he destroys the enemies. He ties up the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. He puts them into this holding place of an endless pit, and you have the millennium. And that is 1,000 years that Jesus will actually reign on this earth. So technically, this earth is going to be here for at least 1,000 more years. Then you will have the final judgment, and that's where everything's destroyed. So at the end, they have this last little battle that Satan he gets released. He goes and tries to get everyone else. Let's go one more time against God. And then this time, there's no fight. God just calls down fire from heaven, consumes everybody. The earth's destroyed. And we have the final judgment in heaven, where we have Judgment Day and then eternal heavenly glory with our God. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say with the end times. But I want to finish this up with Daniel and Ezekiel. I know it's going a little later, but Daniel is in captivity. This is an overview of his whole book. 2/3 of it is prophetic, so only 1/3 is history in the book of Daniel. He's in captivity. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of the statue. Daniel interprets it. The image of the gold image in the fiery furnace happens after that. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a tree, and Daniel interprets it. Then you have a new king with Belshazzar, the handwriting on the wall. Daniel's still alive. Then later on, Cyrus comes in. Daniel is still there. Daniel in the lion's den with King Darius. He's still alive. So if you go down the generations, Daniel was not a young man at the lion's den, let me tell you. He was old. He was like 70, 80s when they threw him into the lion's den. He wasn't this young chap that could just run away. They threw him in a pit, because it said that when they threw the wise men down there that conspired against Daniel, they didn't even reach the ground before the lions consumed them. So it wasn't like you walk into a cave. This is a big hole in the ground that he threw Daniel, an old man, into, and God protected him. Really cool. Okay. After that, Daniel has a dream of 4 beasts that match the statue vision of the 4 kingdoms. Daniel has a vision of a ram and a goat, which was Greece and the Persians that fought. Daniel is visited by an angel and receives the prophecy of the 70 weeks. So that's the big timeline of thing that we would go into during that class. Daniel has a vision of a mysterious messenger who reveals something very special. There's this future detail of Greece, It talks about the Antichrist. It talks about the end time events into Daniel. And then it talks about the future tribulation period and the millennial reign. The whole book of Daniel spans 70 years with 3 different rulers from Babylon. The first part is written in Hebrew because it's meant for Hebrews. Then it switches to Aramaic, which was the Gentile language of that day, because it was meant to talk to the Aramaics, to talk to the Babylonians. Then it was back to Hebrew again, because it was talking about end times. So he wrote his book in the language that he was reaching. So if he wanted to talk to the Jews, he was writing in Hebrew. If he wanted to talk to the Gentile Babylonians, he was writing in their language, and then he switched back and forth. The language, each section was pertaining to the group that he was talking to. So Daniel understood that the captivity would be 70 years because he studied Jeremiah. So Jeremiah was before, remember, so in Daniel, Jeremiah was at the beginning of, right before the Babylonians came and into the Babylonian captivity. He was older than Daniel. Daniel was a young man when he was taken. So he knew what he had heard what Jeremiah had prophesied, because it says it in chapter 9, verse 2 of Daniel, about knowing it's 70 years because of Jeremiah 25:11 through 12, when Jeremiah talks about this 70-year captivity. Daniel is praying about the 70 years of captivity when God gives him the 70 weeks. So he's praying about these years of captivity. Lord, what are you going to do? What do you want me to do through all this? Because he knows it's a set time that's going to happen. And it's a long time he's going to be in Babylon. He doesn't know if he's ever going to go back. So he's saying, God, what do you want me to do? And then God downloads the 70 weeks at that moment when he's praying about it, which is 70 sets of 7 years. It's not a week. Prophesied about Jesus' first coming. So this is really cool. And I'll tell you this part because it's not about the end times. So there's, in that 70-week period, there is 69 sets of 7 years. That is when when the Messiah is coming, okay? And which equals 483 years. So he said, once the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem begins, 69 sets of 7 will come, which is 483 years, and here comes the Messiah in his coming to reign. To the exact day is when the anointed one, the Messiah, comes and he rides his donkey through the Jerusalem, and they lay down the palm branches and they say, "Oh, hail the Messiah!" Oh, he is here, and they accept him in that moment as the Messiah. But then they're upset that he doesn't take over Rome, and so then they want to kill him because he can't be the Messiah. Because of course, the Messiah is going to establish his kingdom on the earth, and he didn't seem like it to them. So they rejected Jesus. But it's to the day. So the day that the temple was being rebuilt, it was the exact day that Jesus went through, and it was the exact amount of years that Daniel said. And after that point, that it says that that the anointed one would be put to death and will have nothing. And that's in Daniel 9:26. It was fulfilled. Jesus was put to death, and he literally owned nothing, and that's why he had to borrow a tomb. It wasn't like Jesus had his own tomb. Everyone had their own tombs. Jesus didn't. He had to borrow someone else's tomb to be laid in because he didn't have anything. And then in Daniel 9:26, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and sanctuary, the temple, and Jerusalem. And that was fulfilled in 70 AD by Roman leader Titus. He came in, he destroyed the temple, he destroyed Jerusalem. And then we are living in that gap between 26. Evan, I think I have one more slide. Oh, no, go back. Okay, I'm not there yet. We're living in that gap between verse 26, chapter 9, 26, and 27, because it literally goes from having with the destruction of the temple, destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD, to the Antichrist. And that's why the early church believed Paul was like, any day, he's coming, because he knew Daniel. He studied the Old Testament. He knew, so far, everything is perfectly timed with Jesus. The Messiah came exactly at the moment that it was said that he would come. And then it talks in Daniel about the destruction of the temple, and then after that, here comes the Antichrist. Well, we know that after the destruction of the temple, there hasn't been an Antichrist. So we're in that in-between time, between the verse 26 and 27, because after the Antichrist, it talks about the tribulation period, and then Jesus and the Messiah comes back and sets up his millennial kingdom, and that is the final week of with the 70-week period. Daniel provides the most complete picture of the Antichrist found in the Old Testament. He goes into great detail about describing who this man or this person would be. So I'll stop there. One other thing is I want to go in, last part is Ezekiel, and then we'll end our class. So Ezekiel has the largest percentage of prophecy in all the books by the major prophets. You think Daniel had a lot of prophecy? Oh no, here comes Ezekiel. Ezekiel's prophecy was really, really strange. Ezekiel had a lot of things that he did that were bizarre. God would tell him to eat, make his food over human poop, and how to lay naked on his side for so many days, and all of these weird, crazy things. And they thought he was crazy because the things that he had to do. But Ezekiel was willing to do it. He's the one that saw the throne room of God with the heads of the angels that were all different types of creatures mixed together. He's the one that saw the glory of the Lord being poured out on the earth and saw the end times. So when someone sees all that, and then God tells him to do something very bizarre, he did it. He didn't care. He was a married priest. He was taken from Jerusalem to Babylon, and this is where he carried out his prophetic ministry. So he was a captive, just like Daniel, taken at the time to Babylon. He wrote before the fall of Babylon, and then he gave more information he wrote after the fall of Babylon. He wrote about warning Jerusalem of the coming judgment and how the people needed to, turn away from their wicked ways, and yet they did not listen to him either. Chapter 25 and 26, he gave two judgments against Philistia and Tyre. So Philistia was the Philistines. They were a huge thorn in the side of Israel, constantly with Goliath, and all throughout history, they just kept coming against Israel. So Ezekiel says they're going to be wiped out, totally destroyed. You'll never hear of them again. And he talked about that in chapter 25. Well, in 2nd century BC, 400 years after that prediction, it was fulfilled. Philistia was totally wiped out. There's no longer Philistines to this day that call themselves and that were from that original group. And the final one was Tyre. So Tyre was a city on the mainland and an island right off the coast. Alexander the Great of Greece, he attacked that island for 6 months. He took it over. It was later rebuilt. And then when the Muslim invaders came in 1291 AD, they destroyed it, and it never was rebuilt. And as predicted, Ezekiel said that the fishermen would use the area to spread out their nets. That's what they do. They use the area to spread out their nets over Tyre because it's completely destroyed and unusable. So every aspect, 3 chapters worth of those prophecies were fulfilled in great detail. So then he goes on, he talks about the end times, how that Israel will be restored back to their God, and then the millennial kingdom. He talks about how there will be a disbursement of the Jewish people, that they would be mistreated, their cities and lands would lie desolate, that the people would just be like scattered all over, but that they would come back. God would bring them back. Their land would come back to life, and there would be towns and multiply in the land, and that Israel will be more prosperous than its ancient form. And today, Israel is smaller than Lake Michigan, but it's the 8th most powerful nation in the world. He has parables. He wrote 9 parables. The most popular that you'll hear is the Valley of the Dry Bones. That's actually about Israel's rebirth as a nation. It talks about them, they're dry, they're hopeless, they're dead, and God brings them back. He puts flesh on their bones. He brings them back again. Can these bones live, Ezekiel? And then it talks about their salvation and how that God's going to bring them back, and they will accept God as their God again. They will accept the Messiah as their Messiah. And then he talks about the future millennial kingdom in that at the end of that chapter. So we know that Israel is now a country because of what had happened in 1948. We know that there will be a corporate salvation for the remnants of Israel during the end times that will happen, that has not happened yet, and that will be at the end of the tribulation, because it's also talked about in Matthew, Romans, and Revelation. Okay, so this is what I want you to read. So then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We're cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. Next slide. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live. I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that the Lord has spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. So this was given when they had no land. They had no people. They were all scattered in Babylon. So the next one, Evan. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, and then we can end our class, is that there is this Gog and Magog war that was talked about in Ezekiel. And it goes into detail about who these people are. So it says that in Ezekiel 38, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all the villages will say to you, have you come to plunder? So Sheba and Dedan are modern-day Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Okay, Tarshish is modern-day England. Tarshish's villages are those that were colonies and countries that were originally colonized by England, so that would be, America would be part of it. So this is what when you dive into looking at what are the land areas of that day, what do they correlate with modern day, and what exactly is this war that's going to happen in the end times, this is what you can come to a basic conclusion of, is that during this war that will happen, Saudi Arabia, England, and America will just protest the invasion of Russia. They won't actively stop them. They'll just protest it and say, it's wrong, we're not going to help you, but it's wrong, you shouldn't do this. Because Russia will be after something very valuable in Israel that they will go and decide and want to take. And that Israel will get to a point during that war that they are like, it looks bad. They're going to be plundered by Russia. It looks like Russia's going to win, but God's coming in and he intervenes miraculously and totally delivers Israel in that war that will happen during some part in the end times. Chapters 40 through 48 contain prophecies concerning Israel and the future millennial kingdom. So, rebirth of Israel, end time attack on Israel, future millennial kingdom, including the remnant of Israel. So that's how Ezekiel ends his book. Okay, that's it. That's the end. I hope that gave you a great understanding of the Old Testament and what's to happen. So is there any questions before we end the class? Yes.
Why is 70 considered old?
Mature age, mature. Well, any other questions? Yeah, that's right. The shoe fits. Let's see you jump into a hole with lions. I want to see if you can jump right back out again. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you talk about Gog and Magog, you gave absolutely no time frame. So is that what sort of we can't figure it out? Could it come real soon before the tribulation? Or could it
Yes.
come in the tribulation? Or could it come, it wouldn't come in the millennium, right?
No.
That would be one of the two.
Yep. So the context of every time it's mentioned in the Bible, it does show that it could be very most likely before the Antichrist. So it's like you have Gog and Magog, then comes the Antichrist into power, causes peace, brings peace to the war, And then Israel, he has a covenant with Israel, they accept him, everything's great. And then halfway through it, he breaks it and, turns into the evil. At first, he's very peaceful in the beginning. And then, Satan comes as a light, and then he shows his real colors, and that's when he starts hunting people down and killing those that don't take the mark. That's tribulation. So, yeah. So we could see that in our day. We could see this happening now. That's what people have said when they said Russia was invading Ukraine. They're actually invading Ukraine because they want to get to Israel. I'm not saying that's the case, but I have definitely heard that. And with the whole thing with Iran wanting to look on it and Saudi Arabia, and you have some, help from other countries. It kind of looked like it could have been some as a setup to what could eventually happen with that war. Okay, any other thoughts, questions?
In today's time, like Syria now, what countries are they today, or Babylon, or they're not?
Middle East.
Okay.
The Greeks owned a lot of Europe, like Greece, Rome, like up there in Europe, and they weren't as affected. But everything from the upper part of Africa into Saudi Peninsula, into a large part of Russia, and like that whole Middle East with the GANs, I call them the GANs because like Afghanistan, Pakistan, all these GANs. Though that whole area, that was all the ancient world of Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Yeah,
Just real quick question. Have you ever done this whole teaching before?
no.
It's amazing. Amazing. I'm just amazed. So much.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you. And I do have an option. I want to put something together for the spring. It's not going to be backgrounds, but I wanted to do something with world religions and understanding the different world religions. How do you witness to someone that believes something differently than you? You have to be able to know where they are and what they believe. So to get that baseline, kind of like Paul says to you, he was a Greek to the Greek and a Roman to the Romans, and so he understood, and so he was able to talk to them in a context that they understood so that he could reach them. So that's something I was looking at doing, and also how to study the Bible appropriately, because there's a lot of things taken out of context, and so I wanted to kind of dive into several of the things that are generally you hear and you don't realize they're taken out of context, and it's like, well, let's look at exactly what the history was going on at the time and why it was said and what was the meaning behind it that person would have understood versus your modern day looking at the Bible. So I'd like to do that too. So that will be in the spring. I'll let you know. But thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate this.